More US and European brands face boycotts in China, but not everyone is buying into the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda narrative. China ramps up its criticism of the US to a new level. Its spokeswoman tries to turn around blame over forced labor onto the US, citing an over 100-year-old photo of black slaves. The top US diplomat calls on European allies. He says only when the West cooperates can they deal with the China challenge. But he's not asking them to choose sides. The real battleground between Beijing and the West lies in capital and technology. An expert and CEO looks at whether there is still time to change course. And thousands of workers go on strike in a Chinese city. That's amid poor working conditions and cut salaries. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. The Chinese regime is urging people to boycott certain U.S. and European fashion brands for raising concerns over forced labor in China's Xinjiang region. Chinese state-run media are accusing Nike and New Balance for what they called maliciously attacking Xinjiang cotton in an online post. Other brands such as Burberry and Adidas are also on their blacklist. Over 40 celebrities are openly cutting off ties with these brands. That's believed to show their support for the CCP's move. They include movie and pop stars from China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, and many are popular in China. A Uyghur actress also joined in. She enjoys a large fan base in China. Other U.S. brands, including Tommy Hilfiger, Calvin Klein, and Converse, and also Japan's Muji, are also facing backlash in China. This new round of boycotts originated with an old statement made months ago. Last November, Nike said it avoided buying products from Xinjiang to discourage human rights abuses happening there. Some brands on the blacklist are members of a Swedish association called Better Cotton Initiative, or BCI. In an online statement dated last October, BCI said forced labor in Xinjiang is unacceptable, and as a result, the association stopped all business activities in the region. China's foreign ministry is upping the country's back-and-forth criticism with the U.S. to a new level. During a Thursday press conference, spokeswoman Hua Chunying once again denied China's forced labor problems. In doing so, she instead reversed the criticism and pulled out a 19th century photo to back up her claims. The photo pictured black slaves in the U.S. picking cotton well over 100 years ago. She claimed the image is evidence that forced labor is a problem related to America, not China. She noted that more than 40% of Chinese cotton is picked by machines and that no one is forced to pick the fibers. Speaking of freedom of speech in China, she said Chinese people also have the freedom to express their views. At the same time, she shifted the blame onto foreign companies. She cited a Chinese saying, which says Chinese people will not allow foreigners to eat Chinese rice, yet smash Chinese bowls at the same time. The saying implies that Chinese people won't allow other countries to benefit from China, yet harm it at the same time. Hua spoke in name of all Chinese people, but not all Chinese citizens seem to agree. One netizen responded on Twitter saying, "I am a Chinese citizen. I also want the right to express my views freely. I want to see news from outside China without any internet censorship. I want to criticize leaders without being summoned by police." Another user pointed out that if 40% of China's cotton is picked by machines, the other 60% must be picked by humans. Someone else questioned another photo Hua showed, this time from the Xinjiang region, and whether or not it actually shows the real situation there. He suggested that if people from Xinjiang aren't under threat of the Chinese regime, they should shoot and circulate photos themselves. While still another user asked, quote, "Isn't it embarrassing to draw an analogy between today's Chinese Communist Party and American slave owners from nearly 2 centuries ago?" The spokeswoman's comments come amid ongoing conflict between the two nations and alongside U.S. sanctions on China. Popular clothing brands Nike and H&M have officially gone out of fashion in China. Their people are burning clothes and shoes bought from the brands as a result of a new Beijing propaganda campaign. But not all of those in China are following suit. The Chinese Communist Party's, or CCP's, media mouthpieces have called for the boycott. It targets all brands linked to the Cotton Development Association. That's because more Western companies are standing up against human rights abuses in China's Xinjiang region. Following H&M's lead, companies like Nike, Adidas, Uniqlo, and even furniture retailer IKEA have vowed not to use cotton from the area. Videos of Chinese people destroying products from these brands have since gone viral. One clip shows a man cutting up H&M brand clothing while saying, quote, "You eat and drink from us and then you break our pot. I must destroy you." He's referring to a Chinese saying that echoes the Western concept of biting the hand that feeds you. Another video shows people burning Nike brand sneakers. The American sportswear brand is one of the most popular labels of its kind in China. But not all Chinese people are following the regime's directive. A report from the Chinese language edition of Radio France International seems to tell the opposite story. The report features one user's comment on Chinese messaging app Weibo. He claimed Nike products online were actually selling, quote, super well on a digital shopping platform, adding that the trade volume increased to the max. Some netizens also wrote that their friends were celebrating and looking forward to an expected discount on Nike products. Chinese media reported long lines outside of an H&M store located in Beijing Wednesday morning, all waiting for the store to open. America's top diplomat is telling European allies that the West needs to cooperate more than ever. That's how they can deal with challenges coming from the Chinese regime. NTD's Wen Hui has the details.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is emphasizing the importance of cooperation between the U.S. and its allies. When he visited the NATO headquarters in Belgium on Thursday, Blinken said it's more important than ever for the U.S. and its allies to work together to outcompete China on any playing field.
I came here very much with one particular focus in mind, and that was to make clear the United States' determination to revitalize our alliances and partnerships, to re-engage strongly in them, and to work closely with our allies and partners.
Blinken accuses Beijing of undermining the international trading order that the U.S. and its allies built after World War II. He says, quote, "They are actively working to undercut the rules of the international system and the values we and our allies share." NATO's Secretary General agrees that if NATO countries are united, the EU, NATO, and their allies are well positioned to address the rising challenge of communist China. However, Blinken also says the U.S. won't force its allies to choose between U.S. and Beijing.
But that doesn't mean that countries can't work with China where possible, for example, on challenges like climate change and health security.
Last week, Blinken visited the country's Asian allies, Japan and South Korea. The two countries also support the joint response to challenge from Beijing. Wen Hui, NTD News.
Major Chinese tech stocks hammered in the U.S. and Hong Kong on Thursday. That's the day after U.S. stock market regulators adopted a new law. It threatens to delist companies that don't comply with U.S. auditing standards for 3 years in a row. Companies will have to prove they aren't owned or controlled by a foreign government. They'll also have to name any Chinese Communist Party officials sitting on the board. Some analysts say U.S.-listed Chinese firms may be unable to comply with U.S. auditing requirements. That's because they could risk violating Chinese law. Many people expect sanctions to be the most effective tool in countering the CCP, but experts argue the real battleground lies in capital and technology. And thanks to decades of business dealings with Beijing, they say time is running out for the U.S. to change course. NTD's Penny Zhou has more.
The movement to push back against China's human rights abuses has been gaining traction. Both the U.S. and Europe have sanctioned responsible Chinese officials. But Chinese state media say the penalties aren't hitting China where it hurts. They argue sanctions are more symbolic and the real weapon lies in the economy. Despite tensions between U.S. and China, Chinese companies reaped over $10 billion of investment last year through initial public offering in the U.S. That's the most in 6 years. U.S. capital is the Chinese Communist Party's lifeline. At a recent Congress hearing, experts argued that U.S. investment and technology continue to advance China's military, and current policies aren't fixing the problem.
We need to acknowledge the reality that our business dealings with China have fueled the country's military-industrial complex for the last 40 years. Even business dealings where we service Chinese industries' demand in low technology, commodity sectors haven't been benign, but rather have created opportunities for the Chinese economy to shift resources away from low-tech enterprises to higher tech sectors to accelerate its indigenization. Maintaining the status quo cannot be our strategy going forward.
Former President Trump issued an executive order to ban Americans from investing in Chinese military companies. But that may not be enough. That's because many Chinese companies may be backed by the military, but you won't be able to find on-paper links connecting them. And in China, the line between state and business is extremely blurry.
So much of the innovations that fuel military capabilities come from the commercial sectors.
The amount of American money heading to China is staggering. According to a recent analysis by the Commerce Department, U.S. public and private equity investments in Chinese companies totaled $2.3 trillion in market value from 1992 to 2020. That could pay the bill for China's military spending in 2019 1,000 times. Over $150 billion of that funding went to companies owned by the Chinese regime, and more than $50 billion were handed to companies directly linked to the military. So how does American money end up funding Chinese companies? Many companies are publicly traded on stock exchanges around the world. Many U.S. public pension and retirement funds buy stocks from those companies. That's through following market indexes. Those are lists of companies provided by Wall Street firms. And most indexes for companies in developing countries are very China-heavy. The world's largest index providers, MSCI and FTSE, each have about 40% allocated for Chinese companies in their emerging market indexes.
But on average, it's about 40 to 41% in China alone in your emerging markets allocation. Now, in the investment world, what we would call this is a lack of diversification or a huge concentration risk. However, this is the way that these emerging markets indexes are right now.
In the past few years, MSCI added a significant amount of China stocks to its benchmark, leading billions of dollars to flow into China. The Wall Street Journal reported that they did so under heavy pressure from the Chinese regime, who threatened to cut the company's business in China if they don't comply. Even counting ESG, or environmental, social, and governance-based funds, which considers whether a company is responsible for the environment and society, things aren't that different.
And so emerging markets ESG funds also have 40% in China. They have no alcohol, tobacco, gambling, or porn, but they have 40% in a country that is committing genocide. So that is kind of the farce of ESG, and insiders in the industry all know is kind of a joke at best, and at worst it's deceptive because you're claiming to do what's best for the world, what's best for investors.
Perth Toll's company, Life and Liberty Indexes, is an emerging market index provider. It's freedom-weighted, meaning it excludes some autocratic countries like China.
But we are a very small drop in a very large ocean. And I can say with a high degree of confidence that policy solutions are needed if investments in Chinese companies are to be restricted in any meaningful way.
And it's not just the fresh money. Experts at the hearing also argue that exporting technology to China has put America in a bad position.
We only have a few years. We have been terrible in this country of gatekeepers of technology flowing to China. Because our technology has been flown to China pretty freely, China has sort of developed or is close to developing indigenizing semiconductor technology in China, and in many sectors has kind of raced ahead. So the biggest emergency right now is once China achieves semiconductor parity, which is only 4 to 5 years away, then China has the ability to withhold what we need in terms of critical minerals, rare earths, and then battery cells.
Earlier this year, Beijing reportedly considered cutting rare earth exports to the U.S. as tensions between the two rose.
If we exercise the right export controls, we can maybe buy ourselves a few more years until we figure out how to have access to rare earths and battery cells, because golly, those are the items we need for national security, and our defense capabilities will be crippled without those.
In February, President Biden signed an executive order to reveal critical supply chains in the U.S., aiming to bolster local manufacturing. But the effort will do little to immediately solve current shortages of products like microchips around the world. Penny Zhou, NTD News.
The global Magnitsky Human Rights Act will expire in 2022. U.S. lawmakers and human rights activists hope to keep it going by making some updates. NTD's Kitty Wang has more.
We are living in partisan times, but global Magnitsky sanctions have had broad bipartisan support from the very beginning.
On Wednesday, the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission talked about renewing the global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act. Since 2017, 240 individuals and entities identified as responsible for serious human rights abuses or corruption from more than 30 countries have been slapped with sanctions under the Magnitsky Act. Canada, the UK, and the EU have adopted similar bills, and other countries, including Australia and Japan, are considering adopting them too.
Just this week, the EU, UK, and Canada joined the United States in imposing sanctions on specific officials and entities complicit in abuses against minorities in Xinjiang. This was the first time all four issued coordinated global Magnitsky sanctions, a multilateral effort with the potential for even greater impact.
The Global Magnitsky Act is officially going to expire in 2022, but lawmakers and human rights activists hope to reauthorize the act by making some updates.
Congress should codify the beneficial aspects of the 2017 executive order that broadened the program's scope. This includes protecting all victims equally, covering non-state actors and single incidents of abuse, and allowing status-based targeting so leaders cannot wash their hands of subordinates' abuses.
I hope the State Department and Treasury will continue to sanction the world's worst human rights abusers and the purveyors of corruption.
A bill to reauthorize the sanctions has been introduced in the Senate by Senator Ben Cardin and Roger Wicker, and a House companion bill will be introduced shortly. Reporting by Kitty Wong, NTD News.
Do workers in China ever go on strikes? The answer is yes, but they do it less often compared to workers in most other countries. That's because they might have to pay a higher price for striking. Many of them end up at detention centers. NTD's Becky Zhou has more on labor strikes in China.
A labor dispute is erupting in a southern Chinese company. About 3,000 workers there went on strike last week after their managers started imposing inhuman conditions while pushing to increase production. The company employs a workforce of about 4,000 people total.
Two managers said the toilet was off limits for people who worked overtime last night. They locked the bathroom with iron railings. Some workers had to excrete inside the factory.
The company has been struggling to survive since the beginning of the pandemic. It's a family business, producing and selling watches and other metal crafts to foreigners. The trade war between the U.S. and China only made the situation worse. Employee Mr. Lin alleges that the company has stopped paying social insurance for them, a violation of labor laws. Company leadership is also forcing staff to accept lower salaries and benefits through signing a forged contract. Workers with more than 10 years of experience take home the same salary as interns. Lin says his salary fell from an equivalent of about $700 to $400 US per month, adding that he can hardly make ends meet.
We already talked to the local authorities, the city officials, but they don't care, so we had no choice but to fight back.
Thousands of workers went on strike last Thursday. Hours later, armed police officers arrived. They reportedly arrested the strikers and forced them into buses.
Around 30 to 50 workers were arrested after 400 to 500 police officers arrived at the scene.
Authorities deleted all surveillance camera recordings of the incident and banned people from taking videos of the arrests. Some workers are still in custody. The labor disputes are ongoing. Reporting by Becky Zhou, NTD News.
Hong Kong authorities are punishing a local clinic for reportedly recommending a non-China-made vaccine. This after recent events that critics say mark the end of Hong Kong's autonomy. On Tuesday, the city's health department said that the clinic is not allowed to administer vaccine shots anymore, saying that a doctor broke an agreement with the city's vaccine program. The clinic recommended a German-made Pfizer vaccine over a Chinese one. As per Channel News Asia, the recommendation said, quote, "Don't take Sinovac, take BioNTech." Chinese vaccine makers have been reluctant to publish their clinical trial data. This even as they push their shots to the world. Third-party reports put the effectiveness of China's Sinovac vaccine starting at 50%, while clinical trials put America's Pfizer-BioNTech shot starting at 94%. So far, about 5% of Hong Kong residents are vaccinated. Around 40% of those received Pfizer's BioNTech shots. Separately on Wednesday, the Hong Kong government paused Pfizer jabs due to a packaging problem. But other than the packaging, it did not believe there were any health risks. Now to South America. Paraguay's foreign ministry says Beijing asked the country to cut diplomatic ties with Taiwan in order to get Chinese vaccines. Paraguay is Taiwan's only diplomatic ally in South America. A Taiwanese official from the foreign ministry says the move, quote, has no legitimacy and undermines Paraguay's sovereignty. Paraguay says it is open to buying vaccines from any country as long as they meet local health standards. The Taiwanese official says Taiwan strongly opposes any attempts to undermine its diplomatic relations through vaccine diplomacy. Taiwan currently has official diplomatic relations with 15 countries. And among the 15 countries, Paraguay is the biggest in terms of landmass. For decades, Communist China has pressured countries to cut diplomatic ties with Taiwan through various means. It's also been pressuring international organizations, such as the World Health Organization, to exclude Taiwan. North Korea launched 2 ballistic missiles into the sea near Japan on Thursday. That's according to Japan's prime minister. This is fueling tension ahead of the Tokyo Olympics and ramping up pressure on the Biden administration as it finalizes its policy towards North Korea.
Japan's leader says North Korea launched 2 ballistic missiles into the sea near his country on Thursday, a step up from a weekend test of shorter-range weapons and adding new pressure onto the Biden White House. The Japanese government said one missile flew about 260 miles, pointing to a short-range missile. Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga told reporters he would bring up the launch next month in a visit to Washington.
The first launch in only less than a year represents a threat to peace and stability in Japan and the region and violates UN resolutions.
He also added he would work to ensure a safe and secure Olympics, now set for late July. UN Security Council resolutions ban North Korea from testing ballistic missiles. North Korea has not tested a nuclear weapon or its longest-range intercontinental ballistic missile since 2017, ahead of a historic meeting in Singapore between leader Kim Jong-un and former U.S. President Donald Trump in 2018. Senior U.S. officials told Reuters this week Biden officials are in the final stages of reviewing their North Korea policy.
And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you tomorrow.